Hi, I'm Mike McLean. Welcome to the Short Circuit podcast brought to you by Swift Aircraft. In this series, we'll be chatting with a variety of people from all walks of life, but who all have one thing in common: aviation. We'll discuss how and why they got into aviation, what or who inspired them, and what they would say to encourage young people to get involved. Flight fascinates many of us, and our guests will explain why they are compelled to look to the sky. Today's chat is with RAF Air Marshal Ian Gale. I haven't included all the letters and titles after his name as it would take up most of this introduction, but it's clear that Ian is more than qualified to feature on the Short Circuit. Getting access to such a high-ranking officer was indeed a privilege, and I found it fascinating to hear his take on a range of subjects. It was also interesting to hear how his career developed in the RAF. His story is a prime example of dedication, self-belief and discipline, and is another great demonstration of what can be achieved if you really put your mind to something. Ian talked openly about his views on the future of military flying and the skills that the RAF will need in times to come. But there's more to Ian than just the military. When it comes to enthusiasm for flying in all its forms, then there are few people with such a range of experience. I'm sure that you'll raise the odd eyebrow during this episode, so let's listen in to the chat. So good afternoon, Ian Gale. Welcome to the Short Circuit, and we're going to dive straight into question number one, and that is, Ian, could you introduce yourself? Who are you, and what is your role in aviation, please?
Hi, Mike, and thanks for the invite. What a big question. So I'm Ian Gale. I'm a Royal Air Force officer, have been for about 30 years, and have spent my life in aviation, from wanting to be a pilot as a child through to joining the Air Force, flying Tornadoes, helping to test and evaluate tactics and procedures and new weapons across various aeroplanes, helping to introduce the Typhoon, commanding a squadron, going to all of the usual hotspots and trouble spots of the world, and then in later life, commanding a station, helping to bring in, leading programs around surveillance and reconnaissance, like the P-8 Poseidon, the Protector drone, the E-7 Wedgetail. A bit later than that, I was the Assistant Chief of the Royal Air Force, and for the last couple of years, I've been Director General of what's called Joint Force Development in UK Strategic Command, which looks at futures and how we fight better for the future. So, yes, that's me. Aviation runs through my veins because at heart, I just love everything to do with it. So if you give me a chance to fly anything, whether it's a helicopter, vintage, new, I'll do it.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I must admit, I mean, that's a fairly comprehensive list of qualifications that you've trotted out there. So if I'm going to talk to anybody about aviation, and especially military aviation, then I think you're pretty high on the list there for somebody who should know what they're talking about. So I'm most impressed and very pleased to have access to ask you some questions. So thank you for your time. That's much appreciated. You mentioned a couple of times in there that you've been into aviation all your life. So can you give us a brief précis of how it all started, what got you started, etc.?
Yeah, I had a burning desire to fly, and I don't know why, because none of my family have done. I grew up next to an RAF base, and that must have influenced me. But I suppose my biggest influence was joining the Air Cadets. The Air Cadets, like many people who are in the Air Force, the Air Cadets gave me some focus, made me a better person, connected me, and fueled my passion for aviation. So I got to go gliding, flying, meet other people, learn things about how aeroplanes work, all within the Air Cadets before I then went on to join the Air Force. So I think probably they were the pivotal thing for me. Great organisation.
Yes. Am I correct in saying that they've rebranded? They're no longer the ATC, but the RAFAC? Is that?
Yeah. Yes. That's. But it's still the same thing. But yes, as RAF Air Cadets, I suppose that represents their evolution, and of course the big changes that happened in our own Air Force, and reflected therefore in the Air Cadets, that it's not just about flying in the Royal Air Force, it's everything else. It really is a partnership of equals across so many different professions that the Air Cadets has got a real job on to expose that to all of the people who come through the doors, for sure.
Yes, I mean, as an ex-cadet myself and a strong advocate of the cadet force, I would agree with you wholeheartedly that it's one of those organizations that sticks with you for life. I think once you've been in, then it's very difficult to get out, at least mentally.
Yes.
You do learn so much. I mean, even just by some sort of osmosis, if you pick up an awful lot of stuff, and it does tend to stick. So I think the cadets are a good starting point for anybody interested in aviation, even if they're not necessarily interested in going into the Air Force at the end of the day. I think that can still work out well for private individuals.
I really agree. I think the Air Cadets, and we're talking about the Air Cadets, talking about aviation, but the military cadet sort of forces generally, they feature very highly. They talk about citizenship a lot, and I do think there's a lot that anyone can get from those organisations. It's not as if there's an expectation or a pressure to join any branch of the military afterwards. I think it's good in its own right. And I tell you, the other thing I find brilliant is throughout my whole career, right up to now, where reached the lofty ranks of Air Marshal, I still go back to Air Cadets, and I love to hear what they've got to say, because they bring a fresh energy and passion that I recognise from all those years ago, but they've grown up in a completely different world, and that's a world that we need to embrace. So there's an awful lot going on in reverse there that probably people don't realise, but it's a properly good relationship between the Air Force and the Air Cadets in that respect.
I would say so, and ironically, the Air Cadets can keep you grounded. So,
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll get my coat. So the cadets got you started off, and that got you exposed to gliding, flying, powered flight, and so on. How quickly did you decide that you wanted to move into the Air Force, and how did that come about? And did you have to go through university, or what was your process from going from young cadet to moving into the Air Force proper?
I was certain about what I wanted to do in life from a very early age, and the Air Cadets really helped sort of galvanise that. But I disappointed my grandmother massively, because I did not go to university. I joined the Air Force just as soon as I could after school, and went straight into pilot training from there. So I was always ahead of whatever application process I could get to, knocking on the door. And I was very fortunate, because, anything can trip you up, but medically things were fine. Hand-eye coordination and interview, things were fine. And I got in and got through pretty rapidly, actually. So, 3 years to the day from joining the Air Force to flying Tornado on my first squadron out in Germany. So it was pretty rapid stuff.
That's accelerated, definitely. That is a quick process. I'm impressed. Right, in summary, it sounds like you decided what you were going to do and went and did it, and it all sort of seemed to slot into place for you very quickly. But at some point, I guess there must have been some requirement for a bit of persistence and endurance. You must have had to overcome some obstacles. It can't have fallen just straight into your lap as simply as that.
Well, the process was pretty good. But the business of officer training and then pilot training was really hard. I as a very young entry to officer training, I was always on the cusp of being recoursed, generally for my immaturity, which probably isn't surprising. I was the youngest person on the course by some way. And pilot training these days in the Air Force is much better, although there are things that aren't right with it. They coach and they help people to achieve a very high success rate through training. When I went through, it was almost the opposite. It was almost a badge of honour how high the wastage rate or the chop rate was. So all of us were very aware that we were only ever 3 trips away from being shown the door, and as I went through flying training, we lost a tremendous number of people. So only 2 of us who started flying training together made it through to fly fast jets. And that was actually quite good stats at the time. So, you talk about persistence and endurance. Well, really, that was about trying to balance being young and therefore carefree and not necessarily always making the best choices in life, making some pretty big mistakes, with making sure that I worked really, really hard on the thing that mattered to me the most, which was performance, and making sure that I didn't undermine myself by being an idiot on the ground who wasn't prepared in the air and suddenly on a slippery slope. I mean, it really helps if you really properly love flying. It doesn't make it a chore, but oh gosh, Mike, hours and hours and hours of pre-work for every trip, just to think it through, to role play with others, to make sure checks are perfect, your knowledge of the aircraft systems is perfect, the rules of the air, all about how airplanes fly and all the rest of it. So yeah, and that hasn't changed. It's a demanding career, but there's lots of demanding careers out there, and they all at times call for you to dig pretty deep and have what we call in the military the big match temperament, and that is performance under pressure, and that's really what it's all about. And at the time, pilot training was probably slightly less healthy than it is now, and that performance under pressure was magnified. Instructors were there to give you quite a hard time as well as to teach you things.
Yes, I understand where you're coming from. I mean, there's a couple of things that have come out from what you've just said. The first is you've demonstrated, obviously, to the powers that be, an extraordinary amount of self-discipline. So that's one thing which I think a lot of people struggle with. They might have high ambitions and good intentions, but you have to put the work in, and a lot of that work is on yourself to make sure that you get to where you want to be. And that's something that, again, going back to the cadets, I think the cadets can instill that in somebody, or at least expose it to young people, as saying, for you, if you want to get on, then you have to do this yourself. You can't. It's not going to be handed to you on a plate. You have to work at it.
I think, Mike, it's really broadly applicable. I mean, we're talking about a mindset, aren't we, and a work ethic, and as you say, self-resilience and discipline. Gosh, they don't just live in the military; they live all over the place, and drawing on those sorts of things to get through what is quite a hard experience is, lots of careers ask that from you. I think aviation does, and the added bit for aviation, of course, like some other high-risk activities, is that there is personal jeopardy. When I first flew the Hawk solo, I had flown it for 8 hours with an instructor. And the solo trip in those days was to fly from RAF Valley, get the Hawk as fast as you can by the Menai Straits, turn up the Menai Straits, fly around the island and come back. There are many things that can go wrong, especially when you're a teenager. So the onset of large amounts of G rapidly that I'm not used to because I've never been that fast. People used to get lost. They used to forget to turn left at the Menai Straits. Okay. All sorts of things can happen, and they're being thrown at you at a very young age. So this idea of jeopardy, that you can't necessarily simulate that. When you're in the seat, you are at risk. And you are at risk from all sorts of different things before you even get an enemy into the loop.
Well, it's I'm glad you brought that up. So recently, we've had a lot of discussions at Swift Aircraft with other people about simulated flight, simulated training, synthetic training, I think is the new phrase, and the differences between that and real world training, especially for upset recovery and that sort of thing. And in the course of the conversation, it comes around that without the real sense of jeopardy to the pilot, until the pilot has been tested and effectively scared about something, then you can't really tell how they're going to react. So you can do all the navigation and all all the other exercises in a simulator, but you know you're not going to die when you're in the simulator. You might get a little bit excited, but there's a difference between being excited and actually fearing for your life and having to figure your way out of it. Do you see the reliance on synthetic training moving back towards more hands-on real world, or do you see things growing in both directions? How do you see that developing from now?
I just think there's a balance. I'm a massive fan of synthetic flying because I think you can do things in the synthetic world that you can't do in the real world. You can make things go wrong that you can't possibly replicate. You can expose the full capabilities of your aircraft, which you don't want to do in the real world because you don't want anyone else to see it. You can build up scenarios that are really complicated that don't rely on someone else having the serviceable assets to make it all work. You can engineer everything, all those things to happen. And I think I'm trying to think of a good time. So I once flew a tornado that caught fire. And as I was bringing the tornado into land, there's a million things going through your mind. And of course, I'd be a fool if I wasn't really scared. You're sat on a lot of fuel very close behind, and you get no warning if it's going to blow up.
Mhm.
And I just remember that what got me through was ingrained in my mind was years and years of running through the fire drills, the hot gas leak drills, the single engine approach drills. And so I was able to do a lot of that just through almost muscle memory and automation in the moment where, you know, your fear gets to you and you don't think quite as freely as you would normally, where, you know, your brain shuts down a little bit. And I've noticed that a few times, you know, under fire, being fired at by people, particularly on the ground, it is pretty frightening because things are coming up at you and they mean you harm. And that training, that simulation that you've done just relies you to click in almost to the automatics to allow almost your reduced brain capacity to do what it needs to do and not think about the things that actually can be offloaded into the automatic area. So I think doing both is really good, but there is really nothing like being scared in an aeroplane and wishing you're on the ground. that's a feeling that most pilots have had at one stage or another.
You explain that very, very well and clearly. It's just from some conversations I got maybe a few years ago now, I got the impression that there seemed to be an over-reliance, especially in the civil world, on simulation and synthetic training, to the point where it was almost detrimental because people were getting thousands of hours in on the computer and never actually getting, or rarely getting, in the air. And then when things went wrong in the air, they built up the muscle memory, but because the internal gyros suddenly got spun out of control, it tended to overwhelm them. And in some of the conversations, they now seem to be pulling back to more real world training. But I take the point that having done the drills over and over again, then it frees up brain capacity. Yeah, it's interesting. And these days, of course, with virtual reality and all sorts of headsets and that sort of thing, the training today must be very, very different from when you were going through that phase in your training as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've seen. I started simulation, if you like, in aircraft that had no visuals because they just didn't exist then. So you'd fly everything on instruments. I mean, that's a form of terror in its on its own, to be honest.
Yeah,
but and then later on, you know, into full and better visuals until, you know, flown the F-35 simulator, and it's very, very immersive. It's very, very good. But again, it's a balance. You can practice 100-foot flying in the sim, and that's absolutely fine. But it's not nearly as frightening as when the power lines are actually whistling past your head. You know, you really focus on your work rate, your lookout, not getting disorientated, because there's just no scope for error in that situation. Or you know, for me, nighttime low level in the tornado on night vision goggles, maybe using a bit of terrain following radar or whatever. It's it's a special feeling, and like I say, you draw on all that training from the simulator, but it's that feeling in the pit of your stomach never goes away.
Yes, I something that I would love to experience. I don't think I'll ever get the chance, but yeah, I mean, yes, must be a real buzz, a real buzz.
Mm.
So, looking towards the future a little bit, it seems to be with the advances in artificial intelligence and that sort of thing, the removal of the human from the loop when it comes to flying. So, looking at autonomous flight for whether it's military stuff with dedicated robotic wingmen down to automated air taxis in urban areas, which seem to be talked about a great deal in the press. Do you have any thoughts on the way the world is developing in that way, and do you see pros and
Mm.
cons?
Well, I think what makes this moment in time unique is a number of technologies simultaneously maturing. So it's AI, it's robotics, it's miniaturization, and to an extent, it's things around genetics and biology as well. But I'll put those on a slight side issue, I suppose. So the fact that some technologies are all maturing round about the same time is enabling us to do things. It's changing the nature of change from being linear to exponential. So it's really hard for us poor humans to keep up with something that doubles. and
Yeah.
and what we've got to do, we've got to let our imaginations keep up with what might be possible. Because we're not asking for thing X because we know it doesn't exist. Let's take time travel. None of us asks for time travel because we know it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But what other things do actually exist that have an aviation, in my case, a military aviation application that we're not talking about yet? And there are, it's such an exciting time because I think it depends if you're an optimist or a pessimist. You can look both sides of it. You can look and see the downside, which is this is full of threats. People talk about quantum computing marking the end of all of our security, for example. But there's an equal and opposite force in everything. And of course, the next level of quantum secure cryptology is being worked on at the moment. And so if we always think that these are things that are going to be done to us, I think we're missing half of the equation. That is that the UK and our allies are at the forefront of a lot of this tech. Much as it's very popular to say it's others, we've got a lot of background, we've got a lot of talent, and we've got a lot of free thinking. And the sorts of things that we're going to be doing in aviation over the next 20 years it is going to be the equivalent of the developments of the previous 100. It's so exciting. And whether that's shape-shifting, whether that's controlling large volumes of aircraft, the degree to which automation goes, the integration of cyber into our aircraft, and it's funny for me as a long in the tooth pilot now, because the pilot's definitely got a place in the future, but then so has the pilot who's never in a cockpit that's in the air, and so has the cyber specialist who enables that, and in many cases fights that aircraft, with the pilot doing sort of a delivery of the attack system to the required area. It's so exciting, and I think the very nature of what we're doing can change as well. It used to be that it was all about the aircraft, and I'd say even more so now. The aircraft is simply conveying different sorts of weapon systems to where they need to act, and there's so much going on before you get to a hot fight as well. There's so much on a day-to-day basis. I mean, here in the UK, we intercept foreign ships, submarines, and aircraft all the time. Cyber attacks on the UK every second of every day. There's a whole industry of people who are busily doing these things, keeping us safe, and nobody even thinks about it. The fight just to keep where we are is massive, and the careers that are available in that, and that's a wide spectrum of things. It's just really exciting. So, gosh, that's a long answer, Mike. And for me, it's all these technologies coming together at once, and the challenges of our imagination to keep up with what it is we should be trying to do next.
Mm-hmm. No, that's we like a good answer, something that actually explains what somebody's thinking about. That's great, but it leads nicely on to the next question: is the involvement of STEM and STEAM, or the development of STEM and STEAM for young people. I'm pretty sure that you've been aware that we have been sort of running low on engineers and technical types of people coming through the education system. And with the recent push for STEM and STEAM activities, it's starting to come through. We are building up another generation of technically adept youngsters. So again, I suppose this loops back round to the cadet force, in that encouraging people, young people especially, to get involved with STEM activities. The cadets is a very good way to encourage them into that and to give them some hands-on experience. So with that's already going on, do you see other ways of the Royal Air Force engaging in STEM activities or getting involved with just youth in general?
Yeah, and it's not just the Royal Air Force. I mean, I've been working in the Strategic Command, where there are all sorts of initiatives where we're looking at doing things like sponsoring degree level courses in data analytics, say, or in cyber topics. So there's a lot of there's a push from all of the services, because the military's all recognise this: data science, cyber tech, and a number of those sort of STEM, STEAM related things are fundamental to our future. And part of the big shake-up that's going on is that more common to a startup business, perhaps, than a long established military arm, is that people can come in very young but very talented and with the right knowledge, and be communicating and influencing at the very senior levels very, very quickly, because these things are fast changing and we need that kind of talent. So I would say it's a really interesting one. We're short of these people, and yet it's not as if we're short of role models. I mean, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, they're perhaps a bit long in the tooth now. There are plenty more examples. It's obvious this is where fortunes and history is going to be made. So I think the smart folk are getting into those sorts of professions now, because if you don't want to be a celebrity footballer, then it's actually quite a good way to have an enormously satisfying career, earn quite a lot of money, and have adventures like you can only dream of. So I think part of our responsibility is to be clear about that, and for people to understand that these are skills that we desperately need, along with many others. But we might not be the top payers in the military, but we ask and allow people to do the kinds of things they might get arrested for in their personal lives.
There's one thing I do find, though, that it's with all the high tech stuff that's going on and people looking at the cyber world and all the rest of it. There's one concern I do have is the manual skills and the common sense thinking can quite often appear to get left behind a little bit, or at least downgraded. If you can't get the aircraft airborne because of a mechanical thing, then all the other stuff is stuck on the ground as well. And to me, I think it's important that we maintain motivation for literally the hands-on, boots on the ground type stuff, as well as the more keyboard based activities. Would you agree with that too, or would you disagree?
Oh, well, this is really what I was saying about being a team of equals. It's a bit like a Formula One team. There are lots of comparisons between, particularly fast jet aviation, but all sorts of aviation and Formula One teams, because you've got this wide range of disciplines, and without any one of them, it just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So yes, without the data analytics, you don't find the hundredth of a second that is difference between win and second place. But at the end of the day, if the compressed air doesn't go the right way around the system, or the spark doesn't result in an explosion in the combustion chamber, you're done. And it's the same with our aircraft. We can have the whizziest tech on board, but if the hydraulic system springs a leak, or it isn't reliable, or any number of those other things don't work, it's not happening. Mm-hmm. And that's why we place such a premium on teams and people in the military, because you really are joining a team, and it's not a case, that there's a when we're having banter in the Air Force, there's always a bit of a hierarchy of who's who, and pilots always look down on everyone else, and blah looks down on blah. But the reality is that is a false view of the world, because none of those people work without the others all around them. And when you're on a squadron, you really feel that very keenly. You're part of this team that fights, deploys, and does all these things together. And you get to know people really well and get a real appreciation for the kinds of skills they have. For me, as I've been in later years trying to get into mechanics a little bit, I take my hat off to anyone who can make these things work.
Right, excellent. I'm glad to hear that those skills are still appreciated. Right, so time is marching on, and we're rapidly running towards the end of this section. So I'm going to have to leave behind all the highfalutin stuff that we've been talking about and move on to the big question of the day, and that is, of course, what is your favorite aircraft and why?
Well, yeah, I thought about this. It's quite hard. I've got a number, and my top three would be between the Tornado, which has seen me safe on many a dark night and has looked after me and kept me safe through many challenging things. So it's got to be in there. The Pit Special. I've done a lot of flying in the Pit Special, and it's a most amazing aeroplane for aerobatics, but very difficult to do anything else. So it keeps me very, very honest, and I love that. But I suppose the aeroplane I want to talk about now is the aeroplane that I own, because it's a real thing to own your own aeroplane. And that's the Europa, which, Mike, you'll be familiar with from Swift Aircraft, of course.
Very much.
But the Europa, it's a composite aeroplane, and I am not skilled in fiberglass, so I have to get help if I ever need to fix anything. Thankfully, I've never had to do any fiberglassing on it. But it's an older design now. It's over 20 years old, and my aircraft is 20 years old this year. But it was the first, really, of the modern age of light aircraft. So it does phenomenal things, but doesn't use much petrol and doesn't need an awful lot of power. It's hugely reliable. I can fly it around at 10,000 feet and then go and land it in a farmer's field somewhere, or an international airfield. I can fly abroad in it. It's got a fantastic range, and I fill it up with petrol from Asda or Tesco. It's so varied. I fly the mono wheel, which people raise their eyebrows at and say, "Oh, well, that's a bit tough." And of course, it's not. It's just an aeroplane, but it's really clever, and it's true to Ivan's original idea. The wheel tucks up, the flaps are connected to the wheels. It's very, very streamlined, very reliable. And I've got to know it really well, as I've done a lot of owner maintenance on it since I've had mine. So I'm going to put the Europa on my Hall of Fame, if that's all right, because
I'm impressed with that.
It's my aeroplane. You just can't beat that. And I go everywhere in it. I've flown the length and breadth of Britain in it many times, and I really love it. So there we go.
Yeah. So your Europa. Well, since it's your Europa, then I'm going to ask you if you will send me an image which we can use to put on our wall, because I have thousands of Europa pictures, but I'd much rather stick up a picture of your aircraft, and we can add that to our virtual control tower wall and notice board.
I'd be delighted to.
Excellent. Well, Ian, listen, we're tripping towards the end of the program, so I just want to say thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and this time it looks like I've captured everything. So in summary, we've got a young man, grew up near an airbase, decided he wanted to fly, joined the cadets, joined the Air Force, rapid progress through the Air Force, and ended up flying big, fast tonkers through dangerous areas, and then accelerating up that slippery pole and coming up to Air Marshal.
That's right.
Yeah. So congratulations on that. Thank you very much for sparing your time for us today. And you're always welcome at Swift Aircraft and here on the Short Circuit.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Okie dokie. So that was Air Marshal Ian Gale. It was refreshing to speak with someone at that level within the establishment who was open and clear in their answers. His history is impressive, and his achievements a great indicator to young people who may be discouraged by the perception that the academic route is the only route to success, and that anything else is doomed to failure. His career is a prime example of #inspiring aviation. His grandmother may have been disappointed at the time, but I'm sure that she would have been bursting with pride at her grandson's achievements. I'm also gladdened that his choice of aircraft came from the heart and not from the corporate head. To choose the humble Europa kit plane over the combat-tested Tornado and the snarling beast that is the Pitt Special shows Ian's true love of flight, not just the image or reputation. And that human side makes him a worthy guest, here on the Short Circuit. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Fly safe. You have been listening to The Short Circuit, presented by Mike McLean and sponsored by Swift Aircraft with the #InspiringAviation. This has been a Zoom Spike production.